Hello and welcome to Festival of Place Social Impact. My name is Christine Murray. I'm editor-in-chief of The Developer and director of the Festival of Place. This learning event is your opportunity to learn from experts and professionals about how we can make a meaningful impact on places. All of our content yesterday focused on housing, specifically creating affordable and quality homes. And today we've looked at different facets of spatial equity. In this, our final session, we're going to look at how we can deliver a positive social impact through community engagement, specifically listening to young and marginalized voices. All of these sessions have been recorded, this one too, and they're available to stream live or playback via the schedule button, which is on the top right of your screen. A reminder that we'll be taking questions from the audience. You can put your questions into the Q&A tab, which is located on the chat panel at any time during the talk. Please feel free to use the chat for your comments and the emoji button to share reactions to the speaker. The speaker slides and other links and resources can be found in the resources tab. So we rely on our sponsors and organization members to keep our events accessible and our journalism barrier-free. So thank you, LDA Design, who are proud supporters of this event, and to our organization members for their continued support. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Julia King, who's the director and founder of Social Place, to share some of her work with us. Julia trained as an architect, and her research, design practice, and teaching focus on infrastructure and public space in the context of youth engagement, equitable infrastructure developments, and urban culture. She worked at London School of Economics for a decade on a range of projects, including super diverse streets, high streets for all, and incremental infrastructural developments with a focus on low-cost, community-led sanitation and urban improvement projects. In 2020, she founded and directed the apprenticeship program in city design and researcher in residence at LSE Cities. Both schemes are novel outreach models for investigating and designing urban spaces with young local people, a constituency normally excluded from planning and development processes, and structured as a series of paid learning and working experiences to engage local people, and notably young local women in public space research, planning, and design processes. She's going to be sharing some of that work with us, so please welcome Dr. Julia King to the stage. So great to have you here, Julia. And now with Social Place, this is your new consultancy you founded this year.
That's correct. So
right.
Kick off?
Yeah, I'll just let you kick off and then I'll be back to chat with you just after.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Christine, for having me, and to everyone in the audience. It's a real honor to be here, and I've really enjoyed today listening to the other speakers. And so, you know, by way of that introduction that Christine did, I'm just going to illustrate some of that experience and just to kind of further explain a little bit of who I am and why I practice. So I did train as an architect, and I worked at Atelier One, an engineering firm, and worked on Gardens by the Bay. But life had other plans for me, and it's never too, you know, and because it's never too early for a midlife crisis, I left traditional practice pretty early in my career. And I started designing and researching sanitation systems, first as a PhD student, and then at the London School of Economics. And so I spent about a decade working at LSE Cities on a range of projects, but really this was when I started coalescing around this idea of young people being capable of researching their own lives. And here I'm sort of advocating on behalf of young people at places like the Labour Party conference and at COP28. And I think this is this umbrella concern that I've always had. And Holly Bruce mentioned this morning when she said that, you know, good consultation is speaking not at people, but with them. And this is, I think, when change happens at you and not with you, it can be one of the most disempowering things to happen in your life. And so that's this sort of umbrella concern of thinking of how change can happen with people. And so last year, Olivia, who worked with me at the LSE, we left the LSE and set up Social Place. And it was really because we wanted to shift from working with young people on research projects into practical projects. And so set up Social Place as a company to do that, to work with people, to enable diverse voices, to contribute to design and planning and decision making. And this is one of our projects that we've done in Lancaster West, which ended up with some young people actually recording a podcast for the LSE. So when Christine asked me if I could speak to this question of how to capture young people's concerns and desires to inform inclusive policies, practices, and designs, I was really excited because for me, this is a methodological question and something I'm constantly revisiting over and over again. So yes, I've spent almost 2 decades asking myself this question. And I think it's really important to start out by saying, look, there isn't one way of doing it. Of course there isn't. But I am today going to talk about a way. And for us, it's been this idea of peer research, which is a participatory method in which people with lived experience of the issues being studied take part in directing and conducting that research. And for us, this started at the LSE and now continues, I guess, more commercialized at Social Place. And so we set up this kind of researcher in residence style program, and we don't always call it that. It's a bit of a mouthful. The Lancaster West project was called an ambassador program. We're right now recruiting community researchers for Holloway Park, but it's effectively the same thing. And it's a way of working that recognizes that individuals within any community being researched are themselves competent agents capable of participating in research on a variety of levels, including as researchers. And it goes without saying, this isn't the only way we work, but it is our preferred way. And we think it's a method that delivers the most for all, and why I'm going to focus on it today. And so to date, we've worked in 9 locations this way, over 11 projects. And in Brent, I don't know if you can see it, there's 554s. That's actually a project that we started many years ago with LDA, actually. And it's one of those things that the projects, it sort of turned into multiple projects. So there's not always one revenue stream here. And so, yeah, we've done it over 11 projects, employing 50 young people. We're now starting to recruit in Holloway Park. It's an intergenerational cohort, and some of these projects last from 3 months to 2 years. So there's a lot of variation. And this method of peer research is underpinned by 4 principles. So the first is it's a learning and working experience, and it's always bespoke because the issues faced in Crewe are very different to Clapham. There is a lot of touch time in person, online, and we structure these so that the discussions are the research. So it's a way of valuing tacit everyday knowledge. And when we hire people, it allows us to structure a kind of curriculum or course, which allows for independent study, where we ask them to do their own analysis, often informed by a video explainer that we do, or a piece of text. And we combine this with in-person, largely in person, but sometimes online, structured mapping and spatial analysis, which is really about kind of claiming space. So whilst each project is different, these 4 modes underpin the way that we work. And we have found this to be valuable because, well, for one, we're recognizing this work as labor. So it's paid, a living wage, and we're paying people for their time. The bespoke curriculum allows us to engage with systemic large-scale issues like discourses around women's safety, themes like gentrification, but always attuned to the local conditions. We structure a lot of work to be done independently, and there's always a degree of flexibility, such as introducing evening Zooms, which is both respectful to their busy lives, but attends to existing barriers to participation. Think about the barriers participating to typical consultation events. We're always open-ended, and by that I mean we're consistently reflecting on what we're doing, how we're doing it, but we're also giving space for our participants to constantly reflect and revisit ideas and assumptions that they might have. And I'm going to really touch on this today. And finally, yes, we get really good stuff from them, but they get a job. something to put on their CVs. And from every single cohort we have ever done, I have often acted as their first referee on that career ladder. So this way of working is really set against what maybe we can call sort of mainstream practice or traditional engagement, which is like interviews and surveys and one-off focus groups. And this constitutes 75% of research methods used with young people. Whilst there's certainly important contributions that can be made by this sort of traditional way of working, we argue that because young people, and I will largely draw on the work we've done with young women, that the experiences they have are complex and multi-layered. And because of that, there's actually a need to rethink and have an alternative way in which to bring this demographic into view. And so traditional methods are great for understanding basic use patterns, but limited to make social spatial analysis, particularly if you want to lead towards implementing meaningful change. And we're talking about in the built environment. So unless you go deeper, you risk distorting your understanding of a place. So this is a classic example, and we get variants of this in almost every place we work. So you start off a session and you might ask a question like, do you feel safe in your local area? And often the response will be like, yeah, I do. And maybe one person will go further. But when you follow this up with conversations, their answers are way more nuanced. In many cases, they felt safe because they were taking precautions to avoid feeling unsafe, or not going out at all, or rendering their public lives to the next changing room. And for the next is a retailer. And I have had findings of saying that this is a great space for us. So this exercise reveals to us that when you allow people the time to share their lived experience with you, rather than answer a tick box survey question, you get very different results. And we think this is because a lot of behaviors, say around safety and mobility and occupation, are normalized from a really young age. So we argue first that unlearning, or the process of learning new and questioning existing knowledge, offers ways of exploring the banality, so for example, seating, benches, and the complexity, like feelings of sexualization, of young women's lives. So another example we can draw on is an experience running a workshop. So we were doing a one-off engagement activity, and although we'd spent time kind of asking and provoking more nuanced questions, there wasn't really the space or time in this program for unlearning and relearning. So when we asked a group of teens, of young women, to design a teen space, you can see in this image, here is this young woman, and many others had done this, had started with the very same thing, and she'd located a basketball court. So I went to this young woman and I was like, oh, do you play basketball? And she was like, no, not really. And then I was like, well, why have you started your intervention with the basketball court? Or is this some kind of other court that you're going to play on? And she responded, well, this is a teen space. And we often find this and hear other people who work in the sector get responses like this, like ask a teen to design a teen space, they end up designing a MUGA, a multi-use games area. And what we think is happening here is that even by year 9, these young women had internalized the belief that young women should not have spaces for them, even though they recognized that young men did. And they couldn't see past the provision that surrounded them, the ubiquitous caged play court, the ubiquitous basketball court, basketball football. When we've had the time and taught that there are, in fact, accountabilities to them for safe and placeable spaces. So in one site, we even sort of did this whole video showing them the national planning policy framework, the local plan, and then connecting this to a local development in their area. And then once they were empowered with that knowledge, all of a sudden, they began making suggestions for change, like wanting swings or trampolines instead of football pitches. So this is an example of reporting for one of our paid programs now. And in this case, we're working with a group of young women from the Lancaster West Estate. That's where the Grenfell Tower is. And we paid and facilitated them to shape the design of the public spaces in their estate. And the report is a kind of graphic novel shown here, a spread shown here of this journey. And here you can see them doing some of the early analysis work and reflecting on community spaces, access to these spaces, and beginning to identify the things that they wanted to be improved, things like benches and safety. And if we zoom into one of their comments, one of the young women said, all our benches are being removed. It's like when something bad happens or they think something will happen, they take them away. It's just wrong place, wrong time, but it's like they're punishing all of us. And the metal benches they've left feel like they're intentionally uncomfortable so people won't sit there. And the latter is actually probably true. So one of their interventions was, more social seating. And again, we see this quite often. And this was one of the sites where we were considering, where they'd made these suggestions. Currently a car park, but we had sat in with the architects and reviewed the various options, which are, also considering technical things like it's a flood risk area. And so the architects were showing how they were going to mitigate against this through planting and sort of sustainable drainage. And it was a really sort of mixed conversation. And their involvement included thinking about seating. And so it was during one of these conversations that one of the young women, in response to this site, as it is currently, said, "It's really tragic that a boy was shot in Verity Close. I want the estate to be a space where you're surprised that someone would get shot there." I was so impacted by this statement, and it's a really powerful statement, and it sets the theme for a kind of conflict of evidence. Because as the comment reveals, there had been a shooting here, and residents had been surveyed about their desires for the space. And when asked about seating, there was a resounding no from the survey, which seemingly put our work, our findings, into conflict. And it speaks to the challenges of consultation and often conflicting interests. Because I totally get it. If you get asked, and this is the reality of what you're looking at, and there has been a shooting outside your front door, a natural response is to say, no, I don't want seating there, because no one has shown you what it could look like, and no one's talked to you about safety. And you've not shared that either. And this is because visualizing such a radically different future is not easy. That transformation from car park to public realm is not easy for anybody. And actually, this is best captured for me by a youth worker who I interviewed last year, who said this really powerful thing to us. She said, sometimes young people don't know when you ask them, what do you want? Because they need support to imagine beyond what they're experiencing in the moment. So when we fantasize, we usually imagine some improved version of our present realities. This is something we try to overcome in our program, because we believe our ability to go beyond a future to the degree of which it already exists is the most powerful thing we can do. So for example, imagining a non-sexist city, like in the work of Leslie Kern, or even left lofty, but equally as ambitious and difficult to do, a teen space beyond a muga. And in doing so, in imagining so, we can begin to overcome contemporary sexism, and in reshaping tomorrow's public, we can reshape ourselves today. So how do we do this? How can we explore that banality of the bench and that complexity of safety and sexualization? And so now I'm going to show you, again, one of our methods. We have many within the realm of this sort of paid program. And I'm going to show you something that we've actually stolen from transport planners, and it's called trip chaining. And trip chaining is a method of recording consecutive journeys with linked purposes, like taking a child to school before going to work, often undertaken to save time and resources. So for example, the trip chain at the top is like a typical working person who might have a simple trip chain, home, work, evening, back. And the example below is someone who does care work, who performs acts of care in their daily lives. So they drop off their kids, they go to work, they shop in between, they go home, they go out again, they might go and visit their elderly parents, that is a form of care, they go out and they go back again. And it's this kind of data that informs how planning is done. So when you do trip chains, and if you collect data on transport planning, and this is Madrid, but I think the same would be replicated in most Western cities, is that this theory that most people are traveling for employment. So here you can see traditionally collected data, 33% is for employment. And when you think like this, the end result is like London's transport system, which we often look at it like this, but it actually looks like this. And really, it's an infrastructure of pulling people out into the center. But if we interrogate that data, and particularly if we interrogate how we categorize that data, we can start to tell a very, very different story. So if we categorize care work, and yes, that is still gendered globally and locally, you can see that there is almost as much movement and journeys for care as there is for employment. And in academic literature on this, there's a whole field of work around the mobility of care, and largely driven by feminist planners. And it's this discourse which is driving kind of innovations in public planning for transport systems like the Superloop in London, which is explicitly coming from an ideology of valorizing care work. Whether it's doing that or not is another question, but it's sort of saying, look, how can we do transport systems that work for cleaners and value them as much as we value bankers, who do a lot more local trips. So for us, trip training is a great tool because at the beginning, we can explore it as a way to evidence the problem we often find ourselves discussing, which is hidden and often default sexism in our built environment. But then it allows us to focus on the participants' lives, on their everyday banal stuff that they do. So we ask them to draw a trip chain on a typical working or school day and a typical leisure day. And then we ask the participants to be propositional, to put an architectural hat on and think about what's affecting these journeys. Is it money? Is it time? Is it the weather? And ask them, what is an intervention from physical things to strategic things like information or scheduling and stewardship? And then we ask them to think about their gender or other traits like race and how that has an impact on how and where and why they move around. So we found this is a really great way to explore that systemic stuff and connect it to the very personal, and then connect it to the propositional. So here is an example of that. So this is a trip chain on the left-hand corner of a young woman who lives in Clapham. And you can see she goes to school via multiple modes of travel and a quick stop at Starbucks. And when we discussed these journeys, we found that she often, on that last leg, will sit on this ledge that she photographed here. And she sits here to watch her brother play in a park just out of the shot. And what's happening here is that she is too old to be inside the park and too young to pass as a mother. So her intervention is a way to make, to allow her to stay here and linger a little longer. It's an armrest. And what I love about this example is that here you can see a young woman eking out a place for herself, claiming a space in London. And it evidences the kind of design indications required to design young women and young people into the city. And we've done this a lot. And actually benches often are one of the things that come out. And we're beginning to use these sort of series of, of provocations as kind of evidence for some of our wider work that we've been doing, for example, with the Police Safer Streets Fund in Essex. And with so many of these women focusing on things like benches, we can see actually that the bench becomes an artifact of our society and reflects our social worlds. So when young women don't see their needs in the public realm, we think that this reinforces the idea that they shouldn't be there, and that this then perpetuates a fear of violence. So I just want to be really clear. I don't think that anyone has gone out to do that. But the typical bench does reinforce and it normalizes social realities and behaviors because it proliferates the idea that large groups are not welcome, that lounging, including homeless people, is unacceptable. And for young teens, consistently we hear that these are not spaces for them, even though they desperately want them. And I'm talking about benches here. So I think it's worth, and I wanted to put this into that wider conversation because I've introduced women's safety now. And when it comes to women, we have in literature what's called a safety paradox. So we know that whilst women are less likely to be statistically less likely to be victims of crime in public space, they are more likely to avoid being out in public due to the fear of crime. We have done our own research on this. And so we think this is essential. We think we need to adapt our thinking of safety if we are to address women's fear and avoidance of public space. In our work, we often see safety as an issue of recognition, that women don't want themselves or their bodies to be recognized as sexual or inviting, but that they feel safer when they recognize themselves in other users, so other women, for example, but also in the architectures around them. So having said that, I think it's really important to note that that safety paradox and the work around it is based on official statistics. And we all know that actual violent crime against women is also more likely to come from someone they know. And that so much of this and that general harassment goes unreported. Just last week, I was on the tube and a woman had a Twinkie thrown in her face because she rejected a request for a date by an unknown male on the tube. I have been flashed 3 times. Did I, or do you think that woman ever reported those incidents? No. I often think, what if we got on the tube and got as many public service announcements around harassment as we do around terrorism? What would that signal? What would that signal culturally and socially? So with my feminist rant wrapping up, I just, by way of kind of concluding, I really think a really easy checking around engagement is asking yourself a really simple question. Who is gaining? Is it just you? Is it everybody? Is everyone gaining in equal measure? Then we're good. But if it's just for the now, so like a voucher can be great for the now, and and probably so, but we should go beyond that. I don't think vouchers are often enough. So in our work, we often try to have, at a minimum, a sort of balance of kind of gain. But ideally, you want to tip that balance in favor of the people you work with. So if you found this interesting, we have written a whole academic paper. I know they're quite boring, but this one is less boring than most, and it's available through our website. And yeah, if you want to reach out or hear more about our work, please do get in touch. And yeah, if you want to work together or even just chat. So thank you.
Here I am. Thank you so much.
I'm going to leave it on the trip chaining. Oh, no, we don't have slides. Okay.
No, we snatched it away from you, but I do love a good trip chain, and have been known to do highly complex ones myself, in the great algorithm of 3 children with after school activities. So I think I mean, you've said so many great things. I mean, to remind the audience, do put your questions into the Q&A. I kept writing down little bits of snapshots of what you talked about young people being capable of advocating for their own lives, and when change happens at you and not with you. I think this story, too, the deeply personal nature of some of the anecdotes that you've shared really struck me, the kind of emotion in that. I suppose one question I have, I mean, designers are often accused. I mean, you kind of spun out of practice and went into academia. You're coming back into practices. Architects and designers are often accused of that of an aesthetic approach to these public spaces that maybe doesn't connect with emotion, or personal experience in the past. It feels like that's changing. It feels like community engagement is now, accepted as a thing that needs to happen. Co-design is still in its infancy. But what you're talking about here, it feels like it is moving beyond that, where the process of community engagement and co-design is impactful in and of itself. Like your decision to turn this into employment. Would you challenge the industry to think of it that way? Like the moment that the moment of when you are beginning to try to talk to people, you need to be thinking about what they gain from that experience.
Yeah, and I think it's when we started, and this was when we were still at the LSE, and we were looking into this as a methodology. I found it really interesting that we were the reading that we were doing, and one of the things that has most impacted us in terms of thinking about, the challenges around payment and all of that reading, we were finding in public health journals. because it largely didn't exist as a thing in sort of urbanism. And I think that's largely because most urbanists, most people in this field think, actually, I know best. Whilst in medicine, you know, where it comes from, for example, if you want to understand like how someone with cancer moves through the NHS, it's sort of obvious that you should speak to someone with cancer who's moved through the NHS. And if that isn't you, then go and speak to that person. But it's less obvious, I think, in the built environment when there's so much sort of like, oh, best practice. And this is, this is what we, this is kind of, this stuff is obvious, right? So I get a lot of pushback around like, isn't this just good design? And I'm like, well, maybe, but I don't think a lot of this stuff actually is obvious. And this is why, particularly for young people, and this thing around like how you normalize things at such a young age, is that I think we can very easily perpetuate spaces that we think might be really great. And let's say you talked about aesthetics. Like, yeah, I think we're really great at designing largely for ourselves. I've done lots of walkarounds with young people who aesthetically go to spaces which I'm like, oh, I love this. And they're like, yeah, this is not for me. And they're totally right, because it's not for them. The price point's out of range, but aesthetically, that's already being signaled to them. And so I think, as a profession, we could do a little bit better with like de-learning some of our assumptions around what works. But I actually think that's not entirely where I rest. Like, I don't think actually that's the most important thing. I think when we are in this, I feel it's a very kind of aggressive and angry time and people are really pissed off, and I'm with them. Like, I'm pissed off too. And I think there's a lot to be angry about. And I think a lot of change has happened at people. And I do think a lot of people have been very have been disregarded in really cruel ways. And I do think architecture has been complicit in that. I don't think intentionally, by and large, but as processes, I mean, like, gentrification is a thing. Like, it really is. And it's a really horrible thing to happen to you. And it's really clear that it's happening. Like, I don't think it's up for debate. And so I'm really interested, because I think the lack of trust that we have in our institutions and in our sort of things around us is like as big a problem as climate change and inequality. And so, it's like, if you're going to choose to do work, and if we actually think of community engagement not as some awful tick box exercise for you to just get something through, but actually as truly, 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 genuinely caring and valuing the people who will be the subjects of the stuff that you're building. And it's not like we're talking about research here, we're talking about actual built places. And that, this is, yeah, sorry, I'm going off and around there. You get what I'm trying to say, is that like, I think it's important for society. I think we need this kind of stuff to connect people.
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of the things I was just about to say was, yesterday we had talks from investors who were saying, we want to see this impact delivered. We want to measure this impact delivered. And the hope, I think, is that alignment will create, because I think there are many architects and designers who just say, there's just no time in the program or budget for me to make this consultation meaningful, for me to employ these people or talk to them for long enough. I mean, you talked about the pressure on that one project where you're like, we just didn't have enough time to really get under the skin and explore with these people. So I think there's this hope that, with greater alignment across the built environment, right from the money side, and maybe, the output of that is metrics, that will create some room for meaningful engagement in the trail. We've got questions coming in for you, so I'm going to make sure we get those in. So one is from Esther Morrison, who is director at Paprika, a food consultancy. In my town, most of the benches have been removed to deter antisocial behavior. Yet we also have a well-known walking trail that is largely bench-free, which deters many, including those with mobility issues. What has been your most effective argument against bench removal?
So, I mean, largely what we try and do is to actually just say, these are local people, they want the benches, and why. And so fundamentally, I often try, even though I clearly have a lot to say after my little rant there, but I try and really center the voices of the people who are working with. So it's sort of, and then your position was saying, don't ask me to ask local people what they want and then not listen to them. So that's sort of a fundamental premise of trying to not to edit there. And sometimes you can then go and back it up. So like, we often will show case studies of other cities, and often it's like, oh, if you show Barcelona, they're like, we don't have the weather for it. But then you whip out some kind of Nordic city, which absolutely bloody freezing all the time and in darkness for half the year. And you can really challenge. So case studies could be a really good way. But I think this thing, I said it a few times, and when Christine and I had a conversation about this talk, it was a lot of it was centered around this thing of evidence. And that's when I do want to say something around surveying is great. And one of the things, as directly to your question, is going, here's some qualitative stuff, for example, around benches, the value of them, why, put some direct quotes in, really sometimes get the young women themselves. So like we often really try and always have the people we're working with for themselves to say it. And then it's so much more powerful than coming from me. And then you contextualize that into like a wider conversation. So for example, we do survey work, exploring things around things like benches. And then you can get that bigger stat and say like, look, we've surveyed 250 young people who say this. And so whilst I really trashed surveys in my talk, surveys I do think can really help push someone over the edge. And it's giving an alternative evidence base. Because the thing is that the people who are getting rid of benches, I don't know where their evidence is either, right? So if you can give a compelling evidence base, you're actually competing against nothing. So that would be my kind of, that's how we approach it. And so far I've been really successful. I mean, we were doing this workshop in Essex that the police funded, and Olivia, who works with me, started out with his lecture around, removing benches. And the guy, our client effectively came up afterwards like, I'm really embarrassed. We've just done this. And actually, so our client kind of got something out of being in the room when we were actually talking to young people. So yeah, have the conversation, I guess.
I mean, I think you pointed that out around the survey can, fall victim, I guess, to these preconceptions that women have around, whether they can create spaces or not. So that deeper engagement still being there, but still that just sense of evidence, because you are competing against nothing. As you said, you're competing against perhaps one person's fear of safety in that space, which is a valid, concern, but perhaps they're seeing a causal connection with a bench that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
There's a question from.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just saying, the easiest way to make a place safer is just by having other people around. Like that is fundamentally the easiest starting block.
So Bethan Thomas, who's associate landscape architect at Outer Space, not in Outer Space, that's a company called Outer Space, says, thank you. When I've organized design sessions with teens, I find it hard to maintain their attention, even when trying to keep it interesting. How do you keep the teenage mind engaged, especially when there's not much budget and these are often 1 hour sessions?
Okay, so I think I'm going to be really brutal here. I'm going to question the 1 hour session as a value from the outset. I think if that's all you can do, I'm not sure, maybe just don't do it. Sorry. I mean, that might be an unpopular thing to say. I just, sometimes I really wonder about the value of doing something like that. Having said that, I think you can do something. I just think you need to be very clear about what is possible to come out of an hour session. And this maybe goes to that gaining thing. So when I have a short period of time, and it also depends on your age group, like we've done work with like the youth center. And to be honest, in an hour, you can go in, you can have like a really great collaging session and young kids love it. You don't need a lot. You just need some stickers, coloring in pens, colored card, done. It's really fun. And if you I often have like lots of like things cut up or pre-cut up already. But it's really limited in terms of what you can get out of that. And so I think if you're offering an hour of fun collaging, cool. And that can be really engaging for them. And you can feel better about yourself. And you can get this notion of talking to local people. But I do, and I just feel like I have to say it, like I just don't know how valuable an hour session with young people is going to be for them or for you. So I would.
So does that mean 3 hours, or does that mean every week an hour, or what do you do?
Yeah. If it's 1 hour every week, a whole different ballgame. But if it's just like a one-off 1 hour session, I don't know, maybe don't do it.
And so, no, but I mean, do you think that it's the time that's causing this attention, this lack of attention? It just can't be interesting enough. You don't know.
unpick in an hour, like what kind of meaningful, because by the time you explain a project, explain where they can input, by the time you talk to them and get a sense of, because I think it's, as I said, it's really hard to think about your own life, like going, can you redesign your bathroom in an hour? No, like unless you're terrible at it, yeah, sure, maybe in an hour, but I just don't think it's enough. And so, when you discuss like thinking about all the constraints that we have, I just really question an hour as a valuable thing to do. Unless you're just being really clear and frank. So like we've done really fun and engaging collaging sessions, but at no point am I pretending to whoever is involved in that project that this is consultation, because it's not. It's just a fun workshop connecting an architect to like local people, and there's value in that, like for sure. But let's not call it consultation, because it's not. Let's not call it necessarily even engagement. It's a workshop, a collaging workshop where you're connecting, and there's value in that, but not much more.
What kind of a commitment leads to these deeper conversations that you've had, where that young person shared their experience in that space? They must have had a degree of trust and comfort with you to kind of get to that level of sharing. So what builds that?
Yeah, I think we've got this sort of, I mean, the project that we did with the LDA, which is over 2 years, and it was building on the back like another 3. That was incredible. I've worked with young people, seen them from 13 going into university. That's an amazing thing to be part of. But I totally get that that's not often possible. And so we've actually found, because we've done numerous projects that are where the engagement, the sort of straight up like engagement, that what you can call it as that, is over, let's say, a 6-week period. And when you do something like that, where you've got 6 weeks, you've got an hour, they're going back to the hour, an hour each week, let's say, meeting online, and pair that with, let's say, 3 or 4 in-person sessions, I then think you're getting an amazing, and then we always ask them to do independent work. I think one of the things that I've realized, and we've been doing some other work with in another context where we're just meeting in person, I think there's so much value in getting people to think about the issues in their own time, which is critical to our method, is like this idea of you going out and doing work yourself. So you're talking about kind of, let's say, 6 weeks, an hour conversation, 3 hours of independent study, and then coupled with 3 or 4 in-persons. I think then you're getting so much stuff. And like, it's not actually, in terms of hard hours of our time and theirs, if you pay London living wage, it's not that much money. We're not expensive. So I think that's, for us, we have found that to be a really great kind of minimum. And when asked to do less, I have actually turned down projects because I kind of don't want to do less. If someone thinks that they're going to get the kind of researcher in residence model feedback, that is sort of the minimum. You can compress those hours and do it quite intensely over, let's say, out of school periods potentially, but that's our kind of golden goose time wise. And that's not a lot of hours. It's not. I hope that doesn't sound like a lot, because I do it all the time and it's not a lot.
Those in-person sessions, are they also 1 hour, or are you carving out more time for those?
So the in-person, I think, again, we tend to never do an hour only because it's hard to do introductions. Like if you just break it down, do introductions, have someone be 5 minutes late, a loo break, I mean, all sorts of things. And all of a sudden you've only got half an hour of good quality talking. So we tend to do our in-persons at kind of 2 hours. And those will often be with the wider team, like with the architects, with the client. And so sometimes those are 2 to 3 hour sessions. We do a lot of walking too. I think I forgot Holly Bruce was talking about that this morning. Walking and talking is a fantastic way of kind of spend it. That can actually be done in an hour. But that you need the stuff around it for that to work. And again, this goes back to this kind of thing of trust. Like one of the first things we always do in our first in-persons is actually just have a meal. And you just kind of have a meal, talk about the project, talk about the limitations of the project. Because one of the things that I try and do is to not curtail their comments. Like a lot of the time we're talking about quite big things like, sexual violence. We're not solving that in any of our projects. But I do think that it's this sort of tussle between incremental and transformational change. And I do believe that incremental change leads to transformational change. And I enjoy having those conversations with young people. But it's very important to be very honest and clear about what in any project you have the influence to shape. And I always welcome wider comments, but I'm like, just as a reminder, we can't do that, or like, that's a shame, but we're going to log that thought, and maybe, that will come back in some other kind of form of advocacy. And so I think it's that sort of honesty that's really important at the beginning to set out what is and isn't possible. And I think this goes back to the change happening, with you is honesty is the most, with any kind of form of community consultation. It's really awful to feel that you're shaping something when actually you find out that you only ever were influencing the color of like a bus stop.
Yeah. So like, let's be clear, this is about benches.
Yeah.
You're always bringing it back to what you can actually,
what we can shape. And often that is, sometimes that's lighting, that can be benches, that can be the size of a path, that can be the location of something. Like right now we're doing, like in Lancaster West, they severely shaped the public realm design. I mean, I'm talking about the walking trail, one of their interventions was like, we don't want one walking loop. We want a loop. We want this sort of 8 design. They radically changed the way that this thing has developed, and the architects loved it. This wasn't about handcuffing the architects. The architects loved hearing this kind of input and then, riffing off of them. It was a really, I think, empowering process. And I probably should shout out to Turkington Martin, loved the process. I don't think this took away anything from them as designers. It was just a viewpoint that is less heard,
I'm not hearing from you any issues with the attention span of current teenagers. What I'm hearing is that maybe they're not that are we asking them questions they're not that interested in? I think
yeah. I think if you like, fundamentally, if you have the power to offer a teen the ability to shape what's in their backyard, like, that's freaking cool. If you're offering them nothing, well, yeah, they're going to be bored because I'd rather be on a YouTube reel or whatever. So I think the premise, like what we can offer teens, is amazing. Like the offer of genuinely being able to shape your built environment is absolutely incredible, if that's the offer. And so, yeah, I tend to, I mean, look, also, I'm drawing on like 10 years of teaching and there, I don't think it's for everyone. And I think in the same way that not everyone should be an engineer, they're in the architectural profession. Architects are incredible people. Like they're, your average architect, the project management skills are off the hook. Like your design abilities are insane, but no one can be everything. And I think that's where a lot of the space where we found ourselves is like, even architects who are really good at engagement, they're doing so much that I'm not always sure architects are actually best placed to lead on engagement. Just because it's asking a lot of people who aren't necessarily trained. So something that worries me a lot in the profession is around like ethics and consent. Like I'm pretty sure it's really scant. That really worries me. Particularly the more marginalized, the more marginalized your grouping, the more responsibility you have around ethical issues around consent. So like, I could be wrong, but should I say it? The RIBA issued something. There was nothing around ethics, like nothing around community engagement. I was sort of going, oh my God, this is terrible. So yeah, I think there are a kind of a background in academia, I think has really helped shape that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing too is you are looking for a very open approach to that community engagement, to that consultation. Also, perhaps the attention span is helped by payment. I mean, you are kind of recruiting and offering work. So if this is kind of a free drop-in collage session, it's very different, or a youth group. Yeah. But when you are recruiting people for those processes, do you have any tips or advice for how, or maybe share how you find the people that you then go on to work with?
Yeah. So we're talking about picking people this morning, and I hate doing it. Sometimes I really sometimes hope that only the number of spaces that we have is the applicants that we get. And sometimes, we have at Social Place a kind of a criteria around like looking for people who, fit a set of criteria, whether that be sort of like free, they're recipients of free school meals, they perform acts of care themselves, from a marginalized background. We only work with state schools, and so on. So I think there's this idea of going, if you're going to do this kind of engagement, particularly the paid work program, be intentional with who benefits from this. And in terms of recruiting, we have found it just to be, well, for one, is do a good offer, like, and spell that out. And I've actually never had an issue recruiting. And we just sort of you just blast community groups, and go to cycling forums, email schools. Schools are amazing source of recruiting. And yeah, it's just sort of relentless emailing, I would say. But again, I do think that why we are successful at recruiting is that we set out very clearly, like, this is the offer, this is what you can shape, this is what you're getting paid. But just about because I do a lot of workshops, for example, that aren't through this paid model, because sometimes it's not always possible, like particularly year 9, you can't hire people that are that young and so on. So like when we do engagement work with younger people, all those things still apply. And I think sometimes we really like working with schools, because then you're building it into, like, say, a school's curriculum. And like geography teachers love us. So, sociology teachers love us because we really bolster what's happening actually in their lives. And so working with schools can be a really great way to do that non-paid work. And also with existing community groups. So we've done a beautiful project with a community, like a loneliness cafe project in Enfield. And again, it was just about we were offering young women the chance to be part of a series of workshops to actually design a piece of public realm for them. So we had no problem recruiting, and we had no problem maintaining their attention, because it was an exciting opportunity. And that was not paid, but it was 5 workshops and food. Bring food.
So all of a sudden the payment becomes pizza or whatever.
Payment is pizza, and actually and I find across both paid and unpaid, this amazing kind of camaraderie of like finding other people like yourself, or being exposed to sort of when you're 13, being exposed to a 16-year-old is just very cool. So, but I think this is where, and maybe, I feel a bit bad about saying don't do an hour session, but the whole thing of like trip chaining, and we make zines, we map, we do stuff that's sort of interesting to do. And, or like stickers and the right pens, stuff like this is important. I take a lot of care sometimes in printing things out in a way, sometimes making like kind of gaming cards. I think there's also a care and consideration so that you then give someone that kind of, oh, wait, this isn't just some boring kind of like write on a, we never do, here's a blank board, write your comments. I just find that super boring. Like I wouldn't do that to myself. Why would I do that to someone else? So, those are the kind of things. And so trip chaining, it sounds really boring. It's just great. Like everyone does their trip chain. I do mine. It's just a very quick and easy way to then start. And even small details, like whip out a piece of tracing paper, show that you care and valorize that work of now going, design your interventions on this piece of tracing paper. You're showing care about what they're doing. And I think when you show care, you get that back. I mean, we did this one-off workshop, this one-off collaging workshop, and we'd come with really good stuff, like, lots of like metallic, and we were working with this rowdy group. They're 10-year-olds. I asked myself, like, oh, what am I doing here? And there was one boy who had like earphones on because he was quite a lot of like special need problems, and he was like, started off and he's like, this is boring. And I was like, well, you don't have to do it. I don't care. And at the end of it, this young lad made the most amazing provocation around making an improvement to an underpass that was like a portal to another world. And, and that was really just coming with the right equipment. And again, not costly. I go to my local stationery shop and buy this stuff super cheap. You can kit yourself out for like 30 quid. And that's multiple workshops.
Well, you know what? I'm sad that we're running out of time, but it's been so great having you. Thank you. Emoji applause for Dr. Julia King. It's really great to have your insight and to hear a bit more about how you're working, and also just to inspire us to do better when it comes to engaging with people and to really, ensure this is not an extractive process for them. This has benefits for them. We know that we get benefits from hearing from them, making that process meaningful on both sides, and really, seeking to recognize that some of the narratives that come out are, conditioned narratives, and that we have to, really use it as a time where we can kind of educate, re-educate as well as learn. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So that actually concludes Festival of Place Social Impact, but a reminder that all of these sessions have been recorded and are available as soon as we close the session. This session's available too under the schedule tab. So you can click on that and view the playback, and feel free to share with colleagues and friends what your favorite talks have. Be sure to share your feedback to us as well. We're always looking to make these sessions as useful as possible to support better decision making in your meetings. Make sure that you're armed to go back to your teams and support them in making meaningful change. So once again, save the date for Festival of Place on the 2nd of July at Box Park, Wembley in London. Dr. Julia King has worked with us at Festival of Place many a time. She's one of our favorite speakers. We've had so many plans. We've got many plans in terms of thrilling workshops, hands-on activities, and that's our in-person event on the 2nd of July. So I do hope to see you there. Tickets are on sale now. Our members, you have complimentary tickets. You'll have to fight over them. It's been an amazing 2 days. Thank you to all our speakers and the team behind the scenes. Please watch back your favorite talks, share them, and tell us what you enjoyed. And we'll see you at our next event. So goodbye for now.